In this video, I'll be focusing on the energy industry and the importance of useful idiots. Let's start off with an article from The Critic by Matt Ridley titled, "The Plot Against Fracking: How Cheap Energy Was Killed by Green Lies and Russian Propaganda." Most experts said shale gas was a flash in the pan and would not much affect global supplies. They were wrong. By 2011, America's declining gas output shot up and oil soon followed suit. The US has now overtaken Russia as the biggest gas producer in the world and Saudi Arabia as the biggest oil producer. Cheap gas brought a stream of chemical companies rushing back from Europe and the Persian Gulf to manufacture in America. The Soviets also lobbied behind the scenes against shale gas, worried about losing their grip on the world's gas supplies. The head of NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, said the Soviets, as part of a sophisticated disinformation operation, engaged actively with so-called non-governmental organizations, environmental organizations working against shale gas to maintain Europe's dependence on imported Russian gas. The Center for European Studies found that the Russian government has invested $95 million in NGOs campaigning against shale gas. Russia Today television ran endless anti-fracking stories, including one that said frackers are the moral equivalent of pedophiles.
But not everyone shares Donald Trump's energy market enthusiasm. In fact, most of the people who want to run against him in the 2020 elections want to outlaw the practice of hydraulic fracking. That's the reason the USA has so much oil and gas.
While RT, Russia's state-owned media, demonizes the US for fracking, they ignore the fact that their own country also engages in hydraulic fracking, and thanks to that has so much oil and gas. Gazprom-Neft, one of the top natural gas companies in the world, is controlled by the Russian government, which holds more than 50% of outstanding shares in the company. The US Director of National Intelligence stated that RT runs anti-fracking programming, reflective of the Russian government's concern about the impact of fracking and US natural gas production on the global energy market and the potential challenges to Gazprom's profitability. Here's a headline from Genova which sums this up perfectly. Russians spent $95 million to NGOs to feed shale fear and anti-fracking campaigns. Most of the West fell for it. Russia makes about $300 billion in gas and oil exports each year. For a tiny tenth of $1 billion, it fed Western activists and NGOs and successfully stopped fracking development in the UK. It's what you call a stupendous investment. Thanks to the anti-fracking lobby, Britain can't avoid Russian gas. Here's an article from The Telegraph published near the end of 2019. Russia doubled its shipments of gas to the UK this year as it boosts its standing in the global liquefied natural gas market. Some 3.25 billion cubic meters of LNG to heat and power UK homes was imported from Russia, compared with 1.43 billion cubic meters in 2018. If you're from the UK, why would you want to rely on Russia to heat and power your homes when you could do it yourselves, create more jobs, and strengthen your own economy? Already a major exporter of pipeline gas, Russia wants to capture as much as a fifth of the global LNG market amid rising competition for energy dominance. In 2017, it started shipping from its Yamal LNG project in northern Russia. Now, do you see the scam? The Soviets have manipulated a lot of you into protesting against fracking. Then you end up buying energy from Russia, which they acquired through fracking. Like many of you, I used to watch anti-fracking documentaries on YouTube and believe them because I was too lazy to actually investigate the issue further. RT is run by the Russian government, but it does not target the Russian audience. If you watched it, you know that it focuses solely on the Western audience. Their goal was to manipulate enough of you into becoming their useful idiots. And in the UK, it worked. Look at this sign highlighted in the RT documentary. It says no LNG exports. They couldn't be any more transparent.
The new conspiracy theory even went viral on Twitter.
Banning fracking and use of natural gas would do more damage to America and make Vladimir Putin happier than anything Donald Trump has ever said or done. So good job, Democrats. You're being pro-Russia, pro-Putin, and pro-Kremlin by wanting to ban natural gas.
Of course, the senator isn't the only 2020 Democrat calling for this "from Russia with love" ban on fracking. The most reliable of KGB useful idiots, Bernie Sanders, is even clearer.
Now, this notion that opposition to hydraulic fracking is all a big plot from Moscow is nothing new. In fact, we've even heard it from the halls of the U.S. Congress.
We have seen evidence of campaigns targeting agriculture and energy as two industries of interest to foreign powers. On energy, we've seen anti-fracking narratives.
So it seems like nowadays, the only way to really play it safe in American politics is to find out what Vladimir Putin wants and do the exact opposite.
RT is caught red-handed, yet they still have the audacity to ridicule it. Someone said in the comments, are they still going on with the Russia boogeyman nonsense? Who the F buys into this obvious crock? So many Soviet propagandists and alt media ridiculed criticism of Russia. As a result, so many people in this online community believe that any criticism of Russia is a lie. Clearly, this blame Russia strategy is a very effective technique. Back in November last year, Putin claimed that fracking is barbaric and destroys the environment. He criticizes the US for fracking, but then he makes use of fracking in Russia. Putin is a pathological liar. What he says for the Western audience and what he does in Russia is two completely different things. And he gets away with it because so many people in the alt-right are extremely gullible. I'll show you what I mean.
Правильная идея, да? Она, по-моему, себя просто изжила окончательно. По некоторым ее элементам просто наши западные партнеры признали, что некоторые ее элементы просто нереалистичны. Вот, мультикультурализм там и так далее. Вот, когда началась проблема с миграцией, многие признали, что да, это, к сожалению, не работает. Значит, и надо бы вспомнить по интересам коренного населения. Хотя, понятно, нужно думать о тех людях, которые оказались в трудном положении, в трудной жизненной ситуации, в силу различных там, политических причин в своей родной стране. Ну, замечательно. А как же интересы своего собственного населения, когда речь идет уже не о 2, 3, 10 человек, а речь идет о тысячах.
Putin criticizes European countries for taking in hundreds of thousands of migrants. Meanwhile, in the first 6 months of 2019, he allowed 2.4 million migrants into Russia. 918,000 of those were from Uzbekistan, which is 96.5% Muslim. 524,000 from Tajikistan, which is 96.7% Muslim. 256,000 from Kyrgyzstan, which is 80% Muslim. And 105,000 from Kazakhstan, which is lower on the list at 70.2% Muslim. Even though abortion rates in Russia are lowering, they still have one of the highest abortion rates in the world at 37.4. Despite this, the Kremlin released an official statement saying that they plan to attract up to 10 million Russian-speaking migrants in the next 6 years to reverse the country's population decline. Also in 2019, Russia's chief mufti, Rafael Gainuddin, publicly said that Russia's population will become 1/3 Muslim in 15 years. Putin says to the Western audience that the interests of the core population should be considered. Meanwhile, he does not take into consideration the interests of the majority of Russians who are Orthodox Christian. A lot of Russian nationalists hate Putin's immigration policies and were calling for him to be impeached. Then he threw a lot of them in prison, and they no longer have the freedom to protest against him. If you think I'm lying, even Patriarch Kirill of Moscow said, "Unlike the West, which is already nervous about the arrival of refugees, Moscow alone has taken in more Muslims than the whole of Europe has done by now, and nobody in the world is aware of it." Why is almost nobody aware of it? Because a lot of the most popular people in the right-wing alt media are paid to lie to you, and they portray Putin as your savior. A lot of you criticize George Soros for financing Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and LGBT. I proved in my last documentary that Russian intelligence is also financing Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and LGBT for the West. There will be Putin fans ridiculing me in the comment section, but none of them will be able to disprove the evidence I put forward in that documentary. Soros and Russia are also linked to the same anti-fracking groups in the West. The Sea Change Foundation, under scrutiny by House Republicans for alleged ties to Russian anti-fracking funding, supports many of the same environmental groups that George Soros does. A report released by the Conservative Media Research Center found that Soros has given more than $75.5 million to 10 of the same environmental nonprofits that also received funding from the Sea Change Foundation. From 2010 to 2011, the foundation gave $26.6 million to those 10 organizations. Meanwhile, the foundation received $23 million at that time from Klein Ltd of Bermuda, which has been accused of operating as a shell company in order to funnel Russian money to the U.S. anti-fracking movement, according to a June 29 letter from key Republicans on the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee. The strategy of Sea Change is to apply domestic political pressure using its deep pockets, with most of the funding coming from Russia. Hydraulic fracking has fueled a U.S. fossil fuel boom that threatens to rival Russia's dominance as the world's largest oil and gas exporting machine, according to Forbes. In 2017, about 68% of Russia's total exports were petroleum products, much of them going to Eastern Europe. But in June that year, U.S. producers for the first time sent liquefied natural gas to Poland. Can you see what's happening here? Putin is a Soviet mobster. He wants to control everything. And in his eyes, the U.S. is moving in on his turf. But in today's civilized world, he can't just start shooting up all his rivals overseas. So what he's doing here is using environmental groups and gullible leftists as his foot soldiers. Now let's take a look at the Capital Research Center, which has covered Soros' support for extremist groups and causes, including his personal war with the government of Hungary. In 2017, they published an article titled, "George Soros Undermines Ukrainian Sovereignty." Groups funded by the Hungarian-born billionaire are on the warpath against Ukrainian energy production. According to Drew Johnson at Protect Internet Freedom, a free media outfit, Soros is behind the work of two anti-natural gas groups attacking Burisma, a large Kyiv-based energy producer. Transparency International and the Anti-Corruption Action Center have received hundreds of thousands of dollars from Soros-funded foundations, Johnson reports, for their campaign to propagandize and smear Burisma into oblivion. From 2013 to 2015, the Open Society Institute, an organization that funds numerous left-wing causes, gave Transparency International over $1 million. Between 2013 to 2016, Soros' International Renaissance Foundation gave the Anti-Corruption Center another $210,000. Ukraine relies on Burisma's natural gas production for more than heating homes. The company has invested billions of dollars in recent years in ramping up energy production in the hopes of weaning the country off its reliance on Russian gas imports. If the Soros-backed groups are successful in defanging Burisma's gas production, they will ironically accomplish the very thing Soros claims he opposes, Ukrainian dependence on Russia. Soros, a prominent funder of left-wing causes in the United States and Europe, is a vocal critic of Vladimir Putin's regime. He's also a proponent of Ukrainian independence. It remains a mystery why he seems to think that rendering the Ukraine wholly reliant on Moscow will advance that country's freedom. Yes, Soros criticizes Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which puts him in opposition to Putin. But in reality, he's destabilizing the US and Europe with Antifa, Black Lives Matter, LGBT, Catalonian separatism, and anti-energy groups. Do you think this is just a coincidence that Russian intelligence is also supporting Antifa, Black Lives Matter, LGBT for the West, Catalonian separatism, and the same anti-energy groups? Bibi classifies ISIS as a terrorist organization. Meanwhile, ISIS is destabilizing Syria, which benefits Israel. Putin banned Soros' foundations. Meanwhile, Soros is destabilizing the West, which benefits Russia. Isn't it strange that Soros was allowed to set up his open society institutions in communist Hungary in 1984, and later in the Soviet Union in 1987? Such ventures were only possible for communists or communist agents, not for billionaire businessmen working in America during the Cold War. There's no way the KGB would have let that happen unless they're in on it. In the past, I wanted to believe that Soros was a Zionist and try to dig up whatever I could, but the fact is, he finances BDS. If you've been following me on Twitter, you know that I've highlighted many Jewish Marxists who support BDS and are also tied to Russia. Just like them, Soros isn't aligned with the Zionist movement. He's clearly more aligned with the Soviet Marxists.
This is not a drill. My name is Greta Thunberg. We are living in the beginning of a mass extinction. Our climate is breaking down. Children like me are giving up their education to protest. But we can still fix this. You can still fix this. To survive, we need to stop burning fossil fuels. Pretty cool, right?
But only if we also leave fossil fuels in the ground.
Greta Thunberg has joined up with 15 more young climate activists. They have claimed that Canada and Norway are violating the rights of children throughout the world with their oil and gas production. Canada is uninhabitable without fossil fuels. David Yeager writes on Energy Now, "If you remained in Alberta during the first major cold snap of the year and are alive to read this article, you owe your continued existence to fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas." Using Red Deer as an example, from January 12 to 18, the average daytime high was minus 25.9 degrees Celsius, and the nighttime low was minus 34.7 degrees Celsius. Without heat from carbon-based plants and animals, either long dead in the form of coal, oil, or gas, or not yet fossilized wood or grass, we'd all have frozen to death. Most of these climate change activists are children. They have no idea how life works.
Well, first off, I think it's great that we live in a country where people have the right to protest and express their views without fear about retribution. But that being said, I'm pretty upset just that people who can come down here for this protest at the same time consume the products that they so vociferously oppose. You know, all those signs are made from petroleum products. Their shoes are from petroleum. Their eyeglasses are made from petroleum. Their prescription pills are made from petroleum. And a lot of them are probably going home to a dinner that was trucked in using diesel to the market and heating their homes using, well, not heating oil, but you know what I'm saying, right?
There's clearly a double standard here and mass hypocrisy from these anti-Kinder Morgan people. So can you talk about how their opposition to oil projects like the expansion here is hurting people who make a living off of the oil industry?
Well, first of all, if their stated cause is to reduce carbon emissions and prevent oil spills from happening, all they're doing today is giving more stock to rail transport, which is much more dangerous. I'm sure you've heard of Lac-Mégantic, Quebec, and emits much more carbon emissions from a diesel-electric engine than would a pump shack used to power a pipeline. So the other thing is that by trying to oppose our Canadian oil and gas industry, we're only helping Russia, Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Angola, Venezuela, places I'm sure that don't line up with the environmental and social values these protesters claim to represent.
I'm not endorsing rebel media, but the Canadian oil worker they interviewed was spot on. Greta's strategy isn't to gradually shift towards renewable energy. She is calling for a complete shutdown of the West's energy sector. Who do you think would want to finance her efforts? Her letter said that Canada must end the development and export of new oil and gas reserves and set a plan to quickly phase out existing production fields. It must stop prioritizing short-term economic gains over the future of its children and all children around the world. Now here's an article from the Financial Post titled, Russian meddling in Canadian oil pipelines uses old Soviet useful idiots ploy. An investigation by United States lawmakers that links Russian-sponsored agents to manipulation of U.S. energy markets, including activism against pipelines such as TransCanada Corp's Keystone XL pipeline, is a wake-up call to Canadian governments that foreign interests have a big hand in campaigns to block Canadian oil and gas exports. By designing energy and environmental policy to appease that inflated activism, for example, regulatory reforms that are expected to further discourage energy investment in Canada, Canadian governments are accommodating competitors prepared to do whatever it takes to protect and grow their global oil and gas market share, not Canada's best interest. Back to the report by the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Science, Space, and Technology that we discussed earlier. Documents provided to the investigation by social media companies Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram reveal that the agents used accounts linked to the Internet Research Agency. Most of you remember the IRA from my last documentary. It is owned by Putin's chef, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who also owns the Wagner Group, Russian mercenary group similar to Blackwater. He works with the GRU, Russian military intelligence, and receives billions of dollars of state contracts from Putin, despite being a convicted child trafficker. According to Twitter, more than 4% of all IRA tweets were related to energy or environmental issues, compared with 8% of IRA tweets related to the US election. Between 2015 and 2017, there were an estimated 4,334 IRA accounts across Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, hence the nickname Kremlin's Troll Factory. Many of the Russian-linked accounts targeted highly visible tension points in America, including protests against pipelines and over climate change. Typical posts incited fear of oil spills and highlighted the brutalization of Native Americans. Several posts advocated the complete abandonment of specific fuel sources, such as fossil fuels, by touting exaggerated claims about alternative energy sources. Where have we heard this before? The Russians also stirred opposition against the Dakota Access Pipeline. Remember Whitney Webb, who I exposed as a Soviet propagandist in my last documentary? She also wrote an article titled, Company Behind Dakota Access Pipeline Rounds Up Wild Buffaloes, Keeps Them Without Food or Water. She said, It is astounding that thousands upon thousands of people who claim to be concerned about issues such as climate change have descended upon U.S. cities with great zeal to protest Donald Trump's election. Instead of decrying that the puppet on the right beat the puppet on the left, these supposedly concerned citizens should be fighting against the real and inexcusable acts of injustice taking place in North Dakota, against animals and humans alike. The KGB needs a large amount of people to prevent the pipeline from being built. Whitney was inciting leftists to go to the project and shut it down. Remember Manar Muhawesh, the founder of Minpress News, who I also exposed as a Soviet propagandist in my last documentary? Well, she's involved in this too. It's the same network. She helped stir opposition against the Sabal Trail and Bayou Bridge pipelines. She said, "The time is now to fight the Bayou Bridge pipeline." This is not a one-time thing. They work for a hostile foreign country, and they're trying to shut down every American pipeline project that arises. This is economic terrorism. Some of you are going to say, well, maybe they care about the natives. KGB exploits the history of the indigenous peoples so that they can amass armies of brainwashed leftists that go and shut down Western pipeline projects. Meanwhile, these sick hypocrites are shutting down indigenous rights groups in the Arctic. Among the Russian targets, 2 pipelines are important to Canada. Keystone XL to export Alberta oil to the US Gulf, and Enbridge Inc.'s Line 5. Yes, Ben Norton, who I literally just exposed 2 weeks ago, is involved in this too. I'm sure Canadians watching this are curious about the Coastal GasLink pipeline. The same network is involved in trying to shut that down, including Russian state-owned media. They are instigating and profiting while Canada's rule of law is collapsing.
Well, it's no secret that the same groups have been planning. I think this is a dress rehearsal for illegal protests on pretty much any major project. But let me just point out, again, the hypocrisy of all of this. The Coastal GasLink project is designed to take Canadian natural gas to our west coast, export it to developing countries like China, to help accelerate their conversion from high-emitting thermal coal to radically lower emissions from natural gas. We're always told we should have policy that's based on evidence. Well, the evidence is this. The single greatest thing that Canada could do to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions and to address the climate issues would be massively to increase our exports of LNG. Right now we have virtually none. If these folks were actually concerned about CO2 emissions, they would be calling for the acceleration of the Coastal GasLink project, not trying to shut down our economy, commuters, people trying to get to work because they're opposed to Canada playing a role in the essential conversion of thermal coal to natural gas as a major source of energy around the world. And it's certainly not about Indigenous rights, because every one of the 20 elected First Nations councils along the Coastal GasLink route, following extensive consultations with their grassroots members, including the elected council of the Wet'suwet'en people, support the project, including the majority of the hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en people. There are Wet'suwet'en people who have been hired by Coastal GasLink, contractors who have been contracted, ready to get to work. So this is not about Indigenous people. It's not about carbon emissions. It's about a hard left ideology that is frankly opposed to the entire modern industrial economy. And I think it's about time that our police services demonstrated that this is a country that respects the rule of law. Allowing people to, completely destabilizing the lives of tens of thousands of people, costing all of us untold costs in our economy by shutting down ports and bridges, highways and railways, in opposition to the express democratic wishes of First Nations, is outrageous. and it has to end.
Made it his personal effort to discredit me. He complained to Pierre Trudeau, who is known to be a little bit soft on socialism. And
all 20 elected First Nations councils along the Coastal GasLink route signed a benefit agreement so that this project could take place. The Soviets didn't want that to happen, so they resorted to using somewhat swaying protesters and armies of brainwashed leftists to do their bidding. It's illegal to block traffic, ports, bridges, and railways. The police should be dismantling these blockades, but for weeks, Trudeau didn't allow them to do their jobs. A lot of Canadians are frustrated because mobs are being allowed to hold their country's economy hostage, cause layoffs, and shut down farmers.
What brings you to the protest today?
Just solidarity, I guess.
With
I'm not sure how to pronounce it.
You can't pronounce the name?
I'm not sure.
Just solidarity in general.
With just like the native peoples that haven't really had their rights respected.
So the indigenous land that we're on right now, the Tsuut'ina, they are a member of the Indigenous Resource Council, which supports pipelines like this. Do you think that it's reasonable to be protesting on their treaty territory against pipelines that they support?
I'm not really sure.
What's crazy is that most of these brainwashed leftists don't even know why they're protesting. They hear that a minority group is suffering, and they think that they're doing a good thing by holding a country's economy hostage. Hence the term useful idiots. The KGB exploits the history of the indigenous people to carry out economic terrorism, and its assets in the alt media shame authorities for trying to do their fucking jobs.
From New York City to Washington, D.C., to Seattle to Los Angeles, Americans on Friday joined millions of students and workers to demand urgent action on climate change, part of a worldwide strike inspired by 16-year-old Swedish activist Greta Thunberg.
People are striking today in over 150 countries. And why? Because this is an emergency. Our house is on fire. And we will not just stand aside and watch.
We know the Soviets fund climate change groups to try and shut down the West's energy sector. Greta Thunberg has inspired millions of people to become useful idiots who now want to shut down the West's energy sector. Greta Thunberg is the KGB's wet dream. She is one of the greatest things that could ever happen to Putin's economy. Yes, Putin called out Greta, then she mocked him on Twitter. That puts him in opposition to her in the eyes of the masses. German MEP Jörg Mutten wrote to the European Commission to request a probe into whether Greta's eco-movement could represent a hybrid threat to Europe, and claimed that it is being financed and steered by Russia. I'm not endorsing the AfD, but I agree with him. That's what's happening here. Greta's movement is having a strong impact on politics to the detriment of other goals, and will ultimately contribute to a loss of global competitiveness and the impoverishment of Europe. Virginia Tech professor Kenneth Stiles, who worked in the CIA for 29 years, sums this up nicely. Geopolitically, this is Putin's Moscow attempting to thwart America's efforts to gain energy independence and dominance and to help our allies to get from underneath Putin's energy boot. This covert support for anti-fracking and anti-pipeline groups is a form of espionage. These groups are agents of Moscow. If we export natural gas and coal to our allies, Russia can no longer blackmail the Western democracies. These grassroots organizations are doing Putin's bidding. Soros is spending over $1 billion to help maintain Putin's energy dominance in Europe. Some of you don't want to believe this because the Soviet propagandists and alt media constantly portray Putin as an enemy of Soros. Let's say I'm Putin. Me and Soros are both destabilizing the West. I need an alibi. I would distance myself from Soros and have my media operatives flood the internet with false stories such as this one here. This CS Globe article provided no evidence, and there is no record of Russia issuing an arrest warrant for Soros. To further prove my point, this website also claims that Putin has banned Rothschild and his New World Order banking cartel family from entering Russian territory. So many people in this online community believe it because they are too lazy to fact check. Rothschild & Co. has offices in Russia, and their operations are headed by Giovanni Salvetti. Global Advisory, one of their subsidiaries, has been operating in Russia with government support for over a decade. While Putin is destabilizing the West, he funds the most popular alt media outlets to portray himself as your savior. Putin uses white nationalists to start a race war in the US. Meanwhile, he jails white nationalists in Russia. He also uses climate change activists in the West to weaken their economies. Meanwhile, he jails climate change activists in Russia because he doesn't want them to weaken his economy. He's a hypocrite. He jails them even though he says to the West the exact same things that they do. Yes, Greta is tied to Soros via Luisa Neubauer. Remember that Soros and Russia finance the same environmental groups. Thanks to opdeepstate.com for giving me the last connection and for sharing some important articles. And also thanks to Andy Sloan on Twitter for making the next important connection we're about to get into. Here's an article by Greta and Neubauer titled, "Why We Strike Again." They wrote, "Striking is not a choice we relish. We do it because we see no other options. We have watched a string of United Nations climate conferences unfold. Countless negotiations have produced much hyped, but ultimately empty commitments from the world's governments. The same governments that allow fossil fuel companies to drill for ever more oil and gas, and burn away our futures for their profit. After all, the climate crisis is not just about the environment. It is a crisis of human rights, of justice, and of political will. Colonial, racist, and patriarchal systems of oppression have created and fueled it. We need to dismantle them all." Alexander Dugin wrote in The Fourth Political Theory, quote, "Western society is particularly afflicted with such an ethnocentric approach and universal pretensions rooted in its racist and colonialist past." And on his website, geopolitica.ru, one of his followers wrote an article titled, "The United States Must Dissolve If America is to Survive." Quote, "The very first thing that must be done is to pursue, by whatever means, the complete and total collapse of the artificial District of Columbia Empire, known as the United States. This is a fundamental prerequisite if the human race is to survive on the North American continent and globally. From the time of the transatlantic slave trade and the Indian Wars, to the U.S.'s ongoing genocide of Arabs and Afghanis, to the endless police brutality committed every day against the working poor and people of color, the United States government has only recognized one cardinal rule: might makes right, the primary mindset of all criminals and aggressor regimes." Remember Caleb Maupin, who works for RT? He was an organizer for the Stalinist Workers' World Party and was involved in Occupy Wall Street. He also went to Dugin's New Horizon conference in Iran.
School children throughout the United States are now taught that MLK is proof that the United States is, quote, "the greatest nation in the world." Well, the truth is, as most people here are aware, the United States is not a nation. The U.S. is a country, and within its borders are oppressed and oppressor nations. African Americans brought to this country in chains constitute an oppressed nation within U.S. borders. A lot of people in the U.S. like to say they are revolutionaries these days, Bernie Sanders and others. I say you're not a revolutionary unless you recognize that black people constitute a nation, and that as a nation they have the right to self-determination, to choose separation or integration for themselves. And as I end, I just wanted to touch on, we're constantly told in the U.S. to think of people who are fighting for their independence around the world as terrorists. But there's a real difference between a revolutionary and a terrorist. If you want to know what a terrorist is, go see the next Hollywood superhero movie, right? What is the most American movie genres, these ideas of superheroes? What is it? It's a white man, usually, who thinks the police aren't doing enough. So what does he do? He puts on a mask and he goes out to fight the bad guys with isolated acts of violence. What is this? This is the Ku Klux Klan. That's what that is. That's the mentality that comes out of it.
So many people on the right complain about the anti-white agenda we see today. Yet many of them celebrate Putin as a leader for conservatives, while he's funding communists to incite anti-white hatred in America. Yes, Soros is involved in this too. His son launched a Jewish Political Action Committee, but guess what? It's not about promoting Israel. It's about defeating white nationalism. And it used Charlottesville to incite the left. We now know Charlottesville was a KGB operation, and Dugin used it to incite the right. The Soviets want chaos. Since the start of Trump's presidency, they've been going all out in their efforts to radicalize African Americans, and we're seeing the rise in hate crimes. They've done this before in South Africa, and after the Communist Revolution, we see how violent it is today. Joe Slovo was a KGB colonel, but because he's part of the tribe, some people automatically assume that he was a Zionist, when in fact he was a Marxist. A lot of people also make that mistake with Soros. I'm not defending Israel. I'm saying that you should also get educated on cultural Marxism unless you enjoy the chaos we're seeing today.
And also, she takes part in demonstration against South African racism. Not about this. And not about this. This is liberation movement warriors. Jane Fonda didn't say anything about that racism. A black killed by blacks simply because he is anti-communist.
Now, let's take a look at what KGB defector Stanislav Levchenko said about Soviet agents of influence in the West. The KGB infiltrated anti-war groups in the 70s and started a campaign called No New Missiles in Europe, as the US discussed developing and deploying neutron weapons as a shield against Soviet tanks. The slogan tacitly accepts the presence of Soviet SS-20 medium-range missiles, while condemning US Pershing II and cruise missile counterweapons still to be deployed. Levchenko said that the KGB spent $200 million on that campaign, and it was regarded as a remarkable success because the weapon was not deployed. What does this remind you of? Now, let's take a look at Medea Benjamin, the founder of Code Pink. She's a devout Kremlin propagandist who works with RT, and she has criticized NATO for building missile interceptor shields. She said, scrap the missile defense shield, no Western troops in the Baltic states, and dismantle the NATO war machine. She's okay with Russia having hypersonic missiles, but she doesn't want the Baltic states to have missile defense or even invite allies to protect them. Unfortunately, a lot of people in this anti-war movement are useful idiots that don't want smaller European countries like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia to have missile defense. Meanwhile, they support Russia having hypersonic missiles. For decades, the KGB has been using its agents of influence in the anti-war movement to weaken the US and its allies militarily. They also use their agents of influence in the climate change movement to weaken the US and its allies economically. Medea Benjamin is also involved in climate change activism. And she was also at Dugin's New Horizon conference. The campaign for nuclear disarmament had a following large enough to bring traffic in central London to a halt and fill the streets with banner-waving protesters united in their belief that the UK should renounce nuclear weapons. Neil Kinnock, former leader of the Labour Party, was part of this campaign. He said that if he was elected, he would throw away Britain's own nuclear arsenal. Who does that benefit? The diary of Anatoly Cherniev, the Soviet Union's contact man with the West, revealed that Neil Kinnock was a Soviet agent. Jeremy Corbyn was the chairman of the Labour campaign for nuclear disarmament. And former Labour MPs claimed that he would leave the UK at the mercy of nuclear blackmail from Putin. Some people watching this are in the anti-war movement, and I'm sure their hearts are in the right place, but they're being manipulated by Marxists. To believe that we can put our weapons down and no one is going to take advantage of us is a fantasy. Putin's former geopolitical advisor, Alexander Dugin, wrote an article on 4pt.su titled, Principles and Strategy of Coming War. He said, "The last argument in this war will involve Russian nuclear weapons, which thank God the 90s liberal reformers did not manage to destroy. It is common sense not to use them ever. However, it does not mean that they cannot impose severe restrictions on Russia's main enemy, the United States of America. Fearing complete destruction, the United States will have to play against Russia abiding by certain rules."